You ever get that feeling that you're being watched? Obviously not by you guys. Welcome back to Half Crafted. In this episode we're taking my Illuminor Szeras model, which I've had sitting around like this for a very long time. I did start building up the base, but eventually I hit a dead end. This is a beautifully detailed model and I really enjoyed building it, even if it was quite a challenge due to the small and delicate pieces. This isn't a kit bash, but I did repose the model as I didn't want the body that comes in the box on the bottom of the base. I want this model to be the centerpiece of my army as it stands for my Necrons. So we're going to do something a little bit special. I've had this idea for a while and I'm excited to finally be putting it together. I'm taking some 1mm plasticard and cutting a circle the size of the bottom of my base. I guess making a base? It's been a bit longer than usual since I uploaded a video while I've been working on this project. In truth, I've been very busy dealing with the voices that keep coming from the boxes of models that I haven't built yet, but I suppose that's what happens when you leave someone in a cell with no company except the internet. Now that we've got that base to fit our base, we can really start having some fun. I used the Dremel to remove as much material as possible from the area that I wanted to be recessed down to our base. And then using clippers and my craft knife, I cut the last little bits of plastic out so I could remove the interior. Now this looks like a right mess now, but sometimes to create you have to destroy. Again, using the craft knife and the clippers, I cleaned up the edges as much as I could. Now of course, removing all this material from the inside of the base has left it quite flimsy, so we need to add some structure back. Fortunately, I found that bits of sprue are almost exactly the size I needed to fill the gap between the base and the base. Just had to cut off the Games Workshop lettering on the bottom so they sit flush, and then gave each of my sprue blocks a ruddy good sanding for the same reason. Everything's nice and plastic here, so I'm using my plastic cement to secure everything down and melt it together for a nice secure base wall. I think the first time I saw this technique used of cutting into the base to create area that isn't already there was in a Miniac video, his converted Renegade Knight. I always wanted to try it out and I love having a big base to work with, and this base is just big enough to really play around with. The two bases now glued together, I've left them to sit so the plastic glue can fully cure. We don't want this coming apart. Now to unite model and base. Now there are quite a few gaps to fill here between Szeras and the base, and I did consider whether it was worth it to disconnect Szeras and then attach him back later. But ultimately that would have been a very fiddly process, so I just opted to use some plasticard here to fill in any gaps underneath the rocks he's standing on. I outlined it with a pencil and then did my best to cut around it carefully. This also provides a nice flat surface for gluing. I figured there won't actually be anywhere to put the magnets on the base as it's now completely flat, so I'll put them inside and cover them up with green stuff as I build up the riverbed. A little bit of super glue to keep them in place, and then I moved on to some old submerged disused pipes. When the resin is added it will be translucent, so any detail that we add now will still show. So far on the base, most of the gap filling has been done by bits of cork, plasticard and bits of sprue. But from this point on we'll be using green stuff to create a good blending between the gaps. Any tools I'm using with the green stuff I'm adding a little bit of Vaseline to make sure they don't stick together. You can use water as well, but for extended larger green stuff work you're going to want some sort of lubricant. Essentially this just allows you to move your tool more smoothly over the green stuff, allowing you to create the shape that you want without as much resistance. And the shapes we want here are riverbanks and silty deposits. I was pretty pleased with this result. You can see I've added a couple more pipes and cables, and of course you've got to add some skulls to your base. Wouldn't be a Warhammer base without skulls. Important to test fit the model as you go to make sure nothing is impeding other parts that will be fixed to the model. I used some tin foil wrapped up into a ball to add some texture to the green stuff as it set. This will be covered anyway by texture paste and stone, but hopefully it at least adds something for the PVA to bite into. Pretty much want the PVA neat, only added literally a drop of water. The PVA glue gets spread all over the riverbed where we want our stones to lie. I tried to get a good mix of stones and basically sand to fill in the gaps to create a realistic look of what a riverbed looks like, and picked out a few larger stones to add around the base, picking out a few spots to add some extra cheeky skulls. Using superglue for this instead of PVA because I want it to set quickly and stay in place. And the same goes for Szeras himself. With the base built up and good solid contact points, it was time to glue the two together. I made sure there was a solid bond between the two parts of the model before I started adding some more gap filling with some cork. Starting to look like a real base now, everything has some sort of texture or detail to it apart from the area at the front. So next it was time to build up the upper areas of the base with some more green stuff, blending those gaps between the plastic and the basing materials. I really do love working with green stuff. I find it very forgiving due to its long curing time, and there's a lot of room to play around with it. For example, did you know that if you mix in a bit more yellow to make a lighter green stuff, it will make it more malleable? Or, transversely, if you add more blue, it will cure quicker. I needed something for Szeras's big stomping leg to be perched on, and I decided on this rock. I also found out from a recent night shift video that you can add pigment powder into the green stuff and mix it together to make it a different colour. It's time to get dirty. I'm using AK Muddy Ground texture paste to cover all of the riverbanks with the same texture. This will help everything to look a bit more natural and unified. As I'm painting this on, I'm trying to make sure that any that gets on the rim of the base is wiped off, as if this dried, it would leave a very unnatural texture to the rim. Filling this in on the front of the base as well that will sit underneath the stone to try and close that gap and make it look a bit more natural. Splodged a little bit onto the metal girders underneath the concrete to make it look like it's sunken into the mud. One dry time later, and this base is looking ready for some plants to be added. I cut up a couple of these larger pieces from the Games Workshop barbed bracken pack, dipped them in a bit of super glue, and placed them on where I wanted. This is the first stage of making this model fit in a bit more with the theme of the rest of my army. But for now, I'm just going to sand down the rim to make sure it's flush, and get a good solid spray prime over this model. After having this model stare me down in pieces on my desk for so long, it feels great to have it in one piece. Now this video is about the base of the model, and I did elect to paint Szeras first. In total I had about 10 hours of footage between the base and the model, so my next video will focus on painting Szeras as best as I can. If you want to see that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. I deliberated for a long time what the right colours were for the bottom of a riverbed. And after staring at reference pictures for hours on end, I finally decided it was better to go lighter and darken things down, rather than start off darker and try and brighten things up. So I started out with a base of pale sand. For the riverbanks I started off with some watered down Vallejo red leather, which I gradually stippled on around the base. Because this is watered down almost to a wash, it does show some of the black through, which is what I wanted. Next, to darken down the riverbed, I used some washes and contrast paints to add some colour variation. I dabbed in some Achillean green in some random spots along the riverbed, and then used some Nuln Oil before it dried to wet blend everything together. This nicely darkened down the recesses without losing that off-white that pebbles tend to have. Next I picked out some metallic details around the base. This pipe that passes over the river, the two submerged old pipes, and this destroyed support strut that's attached to the concrete. I gave that a quick dry brush. To give more colour variation and realism to the stream bed, I went around with some Black Templar contrast and picked out random pebbles. There's always massive variation between stones in a river, so going around with some earthy tones really helps bring realism to the bottom of this river. And I picked out some stones on the riverbank as well, to break it up and help blend it into the river. The dirt was looking a bit too Martian, so I watered down some 2 thin coats boar hide and stippled this along the edge of the riverbank, building it up and being a bit more aggressive with the stippling in certain areas. This added more texture and darkened things down to more of a dirt tone that I wanted. I also mix a little bit of the leftover off-white into some black to create a grey to coat some of the rocks on the base. It was weirdly satisfying picking out random stones to hit with some black or grey, haphazard and random detailing. Time for a nice bath, for the dirt and all-over wash of Agrax Earthshade. This again helps blend any colours that we've stippled on together and darkens down any recesses that we might have around the riverbanks. It's always satisfying putting a wash over everything that really brings out all the detail that you've worked on. Do be wary that the wash you're using isn't too glossy however. This can really ruin the scale of things if they're glossy when they shouldn't be, and you'll probably just end up going back around with matte medium. After that wash has dried, I'm painting all of the concrete, broken down looking rocks with Black Templar. I want a nice solid base here. Even though they are black, I need a really matte looking black for a different looking stone. Then with some pale sand, I'm dry brushing the edges of the concrete slabs, covering more of the surface as there's less paint on the dry brush. I tried to carefully pick out a couple of other areas on the base, but mostly this was focused on the concrete. The colour palette of this model is quite dark, and I wanted the concrete to stand out but not be bright like most concrete is compared to other stone. Time to paint some skulls. Now, much like skinning a cat, there is more than one way to go about painting a skull. Different methods have their different benefits. Unlike skinning a cat, you really shouldn't be looking up different ways to skin cats, it's not healthy. So I base coated all of these skulls with a bit of Vampire Fang from Tooth and Coats. Or was it Citadel Screaming Skull? I forget. Either way, I made sure they got a good coverage with 2 thin coats. I always like thinking of the stories behind these skulls while I'm painting them, and there's a good mix on this base, like this Orky skull. Some speedy rust effects with Dirty Down Rust. Now the bottle does instruct you to warm up the model and the bottle before you apply this, so that's what I've done with a hairdryer, just warmed up the base and the bottle before I slapped some onto the metal parts. This really helps add some contrast to some of the more plain metal areas on the model, like this rebar sticking out the concrete and these gouged up I-beams on the bottom of the concrete. There's a couple of sneaky scarabs scuttling around this base, so I just brightened them up with a little bit of mithril, and made sure their orb and eye were dotted white to add magenta to later. Coming back to the skulls, I gave them a wash of Agrax Earthshade to darken them down. Larger skulls like this are great fun because there's more recesses on them to work with. And then I brightened them back up again with either Vampire Fang or Screaming Skull. It's a mystery to me, but it looks great. I tried to bear in mind where the shadows would be cast across the skulls, and where they would be getting most dirty while I was doing this. When I was finishing up with the off-whites, I added just a little streak down the middle of each of the plant veins. This is because I knew that I was going to quickly coat these plants with some contrast paints, and the white would stand out underneath the translucent layer. Resin time, aka brown trousers time, aka make or break time, aka makes a right bloody mess, but very worth it time. I poured equal parts of this 2-part epoxy, and then combined them together with a little bit of ink in a mixing cup. I'm using 2 liquid raw alcohol inks here, one green and one tiny little bit of blue. The time rapidly approaches where I will have to pour all this nasty resin over my hard work, hours and hours of work. And I wanted to do everything I could to make sure there would be no leaks. Now on the inside we already have sprue plastic glued down and we already have green stuff, but I wasn't going to take any chances. So I put blue tack all around the edge of the base. To protect my work surface, I put it in an empty takeaway container and perched it on a glass ramekin. Nothing to be done now but pour the resin. No going back after this, but the model's not going to get completed without it. Say a prayer, cross your fingers, pucker your butt cheeks. Just gotta pour. I killed some of the surface tension at the edges with a cocktail stick, allowing the resin to flow into the areas it needed to. Used a blowtorch to pop any bubbles quickly, and then I left it to cure. An entire day later, and our resin is cured, and it looks absolutely beautiful. 0 leaks. I don't think the blue tack was necessary, but I'm glad I had it on there. Always use protection. Our old friends Mr. T and Kermit the Flock join us for some quick flocking. I still think dried tea is one of the best substitutes you can use to simulate leaves and dried sticks on a woodland floor, and this is the last touch I'll use to link this model's theme with the rest of my army theme. I tried to get this everywhere I think leaves and debris would collect, not too close to the water though, as that would wash away. And then some bright green sawdust flock to replicate some sort of green growth or moss growing in certain areas. Tap off the excess, and then it's tough time. I cut up a few of these tufts with my craft knife, breaking them into smaller chunks to sneak into tighter corners, and made sure that any excess tuft that was hanging off of edges was clipped away with my clippers. Sealed the flock in with isopropyl alcohol and watered down PVA, and after another day of waiting for that PVA to dry, it was finally time to add the finishing touches, black around the rim, and sit back and admire another project no longer half-crafted. Thank you for watching. As I said, next video painting up Illuminor Szeras in as much detail as I can, so subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you next time.